Okay, the assignment for this class is sort of a two-part assignment. When animating secondary action is basically second to the primary action. So when a character is animating and moving around, the movement of the character is the primary action. And if there's anything hanging off the character or dangling off the character, that would be secondary action. Now there could be something rigid hanging off the character, it'd be like a rigid secondary action, but most of the time it's something that's soft, so it'd be like a soft secondary action, something soft and flexible. So the outcome of this class is we're going to practice the wave principle, which will give us all the techniques that we really need to animate anything flexible that might be dangling off a character, like a scarf or some floppy ears or somebody carrying a towel. We're going to be practicing the wave principle to animate something like that, and it looks like this. And then we're going to animate a character hopping along, a simple character hopping along. It's our Fork-In-Ripe Avocado, and we're going to have a rigid object, which is this fork sticking out of his forehead. That'll be the secondary action for a rigid object, and then we have a soft object, which is the leaf, and that'll be some soft secondary action. So the rigid object is pretty straightforward. The leaf is a little bit more tricky. It requires a little bit of overlap and drag. We'll learn how to do that with this wave principle first. Okay, so open up a fresh Flash file and just expand your timeline to, let's go up to 26. We're just going to use a brush, so just turn on your brush tool or hit B on your keyboard, and you can make the brush size a little bit bigger. I'm just going to start at the bottom, and we're going to animate something that looks like it could be a tail, maybe a cat or a dog wagging its tail, and we'll just practice the wave principle that way. Now for the wave principle, you'll really only need about 2 different poses. We're going to simplify things a little bit. We'll have one shape that just looks like this, and we're just going to do it with a line. We're not going to animate, we're not going to draw a detailed object. So once we do that, we can make a symbol out of this. So just select the whole paint stroke and hit F8 on your keyboard, and we'll create a symbol. I'm just going to call it tail. I'm just going to leave it on graphic and hit OK. The first thing you want to do is turn on your free transform tool or Q on your keyboard, and let's move the pivot point down to the bottom. You'll want to turn snap to objects on so you can snap it right to the bottom. Just snap it right to the base of this line. Okay, so let's double click to get inside this symbol. So we have our artwork, it's just one paint stroke. Let's go to the frame right next to it, and we'll create a new piece of art, and just hit F7 for a blank keyframe, and we'll turn on our onion skinning so we can see the old one. And then back to our brush tool. And what we want to do is create one that's more like an S shape, something a little more like this. And then I'll just go to my selection tool and bounce back out here. Alright, so first thing you want to do before we start animating is make sure that the symbol is on single frame. It should be on loop. Just change it to single frame and leave that first instance on 1. And we'll just start animating this thing. So let's go about 4 frames down the time, or no, let's go 3 frames down the timeline. This is going to be a cycle, so we're not going to leave a hold at the beginning. And we'll just hit F6. So this will be our first pose. So I'm going to go to my free transform tool. We're 3 frames down the timeline, and we'll just rotate it about halfway. We're going to get it down here more. So I'll just rotate it about halfway there. And then I'll go another 3 frames on my timeline, set a key, F6 that, and bring it right down. Now once we get to this point, this is a tail wagging, and it's going towards screen left. So it's got drag on it just from the pose that we set it in. It's dragging that in the opposite direction that it's going. Now at this point, the tail is going to flip around and wag the other way. But what happens is the base of the tail is where the energy is being created. So the base of the tail will actually start to head towards screen right before the tip of the tail. And that's why we created that S-shaped tail. So what we can do at this point is set a key right next to it, and we're just going to flip the artwork. We're just going to switch the artwork, I should say. So we'll press F6 with no in-betweens. We'll just set a key right next to it. Select the symbol, and we'll go to the properties here and just up arrow or press 2 to get to the new tail that we drew. This will be our new pose. So you can see the base of the tail at this point is starting to actually head back as the tail wags, but the top of the tail doesn't really realize it needs to do that yet. It's still dragging the way it was before. So we'll set another key right next to that, and we're going to go back to more of a C-curve shape, just like the one we had before. So we'll actually select the symbol, and go back to 1. Go back to our pose 1 so we can down arrow to get to it. But we'll flip it around this time. And we're going to do some overlapping action on this. So we're just going to flip it around and move it down so that, I'm just going to adjust my my onion skinning here so we can just see the last pose. What we really want, the key here is to get some overlapping action right in this area. You really want these tails to overlap each other. And this is the trick to the wave principle. It's what makes it look like it's actually flapping. Now that we get to this pose, we can go another 3 frames down the timeline and start to actually bring it back up again. So I'll just press F6 to set another key, and we'll bring it back up about halfway. And we're just going to do these 3 frames apart. I'll get it back to the top. I'll hit F6 again. Just 3 frames apart. We'll bring it right back to the top again. I'm just going to keep going 3 frames apart until I get to the point where it's gonna whip again. So we'll halfway. Another 3 frames, F6, and bring it right down. And at this point, this is where we're going to actually flip it or change the artwork. We're going to set another key right next to it and do the same thing we did on the other side. Select the symbol and change the artwork. So at this point, again, the base of the tail is starting to make its way back towards screen left, but the top of the tail is still dragging. All the energy is coming from the base of the tail. It's the driving force. So we'll leave it on that pose for 1 frame, and then we'll bring it to, we'll go 1 frame down the timeline again and flip it again. So we'll change the artwork and then we'll flip it. And we want to make sure we get that overlapping action at this point. So we're going to rotate it down so that the tips are overlapping just like that. And then we'll go 3 frames apart again and start to bring it right back up to its original pose. So F6, we'll go about halfway up, another 3 frames down the timeline, and we go right back to our original position. So at this point we can really just copy the first frame. We'll just copy frames and paste the last one. Paste it to the last frame. And if we play that, this is pretty much blocked in. We have this whipping action. So let's just tween all that. We can just hold shift down, select somewhere between the first 2 keyframes and shift select the last frame. We'll just go create classic tween. And if we play that now, we'll just turn our looping on and we'll expand our looping range right to the end. And if we play that now, we can see we have this tail wag. And you can see it's a little bit slower near the top, and then it whips. There's a whipping action at both ends. To get that whipping action, you really need to have the drag at the top of the tail, and you need that overlapping action. Now this can be refined a little bit further to avoid that popping at the bottom, but this is the general idea for the wave principle. And that can also be done with the line tool. We did one with the line tool as well. And you can see all the poses of the wave principle right here in our onion skinning. And it's basically just, all it is, we just created a line with the line tool. If you dive inside that symbol, we just have 2 poses, this line and this line. And it's the same thing. We just took this line and bent it and just created an S-shaped line and a C-curve line. And it animates the same way. Looks really cool if you have 2 playing in the same file. Alright, so let's try some of this on our avocado character. Alright, so let's open up our Fork-In-Ripe Avocado. So once you open this, you'll see that we have, just like in our last session, we have our camera view, which stays put and stays locked. We have our shot comp, which we're going to go inside and animate in. So in the last few sessions, we covered the animation principles of timing, slow in, slow out, stretch and squash, and path of action. In this session, we'll cover how to animate secondary action and the wave principle, with a rigid object being the fork and a soft object being this leaf. We'll also cover the animation principle of anticipation, or antic, otherwise known as antic, and how and why to overshoot and settle your character or your object. And we're going to look at how to turn a character around or any piece of artwork around to face the other way without the appearance of popping or flipping. So let's get started. Let's just dive into our shot comp. You can select it by double clicking on this pivot point here or just clicking on the character itself. So now we're inside the shot comp, and you can see that in this bar, we went from scene 1. We have scene 1, and now we have shot comp. That means we're inside the shot comp. And in the shot comp, we have 3 new layers. We have character, background, like we did in the other one, but now we have a new one called shadow, which is just underneath the character so that it's behind him. And we're going to animate this shadow at the end when we're finished. Select our character. This is the master symbol for this character. It takes everything with it. Let's double click on that to go inside, and then if you drag select over the whole character, you'll see that the fork, stem, leaf, and his body are all separate symbols that we can animate. So before we start animating, we actually have to insert frames into this timeline. So let's just go right up to frame 100 and select all the frames from top to bottom and right click on it and insert frames. And now we can scrub along the timeline. So let's double click out to get back to the shot comp and do the same thing. Insert frame, and we can back out again to get the scene 1, and we'll do the same thing for the shot comp and the camera view. 100, insert frame. Okay, so let's go back into the shot comp, make sure we have 100 frames here, back into the master symbol for the avocado, and we have 100 frames here as well. So that's 3 different layers in Flash that we have 100 frames on. So we're going to go with the same workflow that we've been using in the last couple of sessions, and the same workflow we'll always use when we're animating. Same workflow I always use on the job is blocking our main action first, refine that, get the timing and posing as good as you possibly can, and then once you're happy with it, check it, refine it, check it until it's as perfect as you can get it. Once we're finished with the main action, we're going to go through and animate the fork, and then we're going to go and do the leaf at the end. So the first thing we're going to do is go back to our shot comp layer where we have our 3 layers, character, shadow, and background. Just go to the top layer on character and create a new layer. We're going to draw in our path of action first. So just double click on that and call it path of action. And just go to frame 1 and let's select our brush tool, or B on the keyboard, and we'll make that red. Just click it again. Let's bring the alpha down to about 50 so it'll be somewhat transparent. And let's draw out our path of action that he's going to take as he hops along. In the last session we animated a ball bounce, and every bounce became less and less because it loses energy as it goes. But this guy is actually alive, so we're going to have 2 equal bounces because he can propel himself. And then we'll just do one little small hop at the end and he'll turn around here and face the other way. Okay, so there we have our path of action. Let's go back to our selection tool, V on the keyboard, and let's go back inside our avocado. Okay, so let's start blocking this guy out. So let's go down the timeline about 4 frames. Remember, it's our greater than less than keys next to the M on the keyboard. I'm just going to tap the one that points to the right, 4 or 5 frames. Select the whole row of body parts and press F6 to set a key. Now we can pose our character. So we already have everything selected. So press Q on your keyboard to activate the free transform tool, or you can select it here on the toolbar. Let's move the pivot point down. Make sure your snap to objects is activated, and we're going to snap it to the bottom here somewhere. Doesn't have to be perfectly on the manipulation point, just somewhere at the bottom of his body is fine. And let's give him a squash. So squash him an equal distance in Y as you do in X, and let's rotate him a little bit. So this is going to be his anticipation pose. He's anticipating the jump. An anticipation pose is basically a character or object anticipate in the opposite direction first. So it helps the audience to know what's about to happen, and then it gives the audience satisfaction when it actually happens. So it really just feels right. Our first key pose is an anticipation pose. Now let's turn on our onion skinning. So now we can see the difference between our 2 poses. As soon as you turn on onion skinning, we get these 2 brackets. It basically displays a range in which we can view the poses that are in that range. So I'm just going to slide this one out so we can see both our initial pose and our anticipation pose. So here's our antic. Now we're going to have him launch off the ground. It's going to be rather quick. I already know that, so I'm only going to go 2 more frames down the timeline and set a key, F6. Now 2 more frames down the timeline basically means that there's only one frame in between our 2 poses. So there's only one in between pose 2 and 3. So I'll just select the entire guy here, and let's move the pivot point back down. Now in Flash, whenever you have multiple symbols selected, you always have to set the pivot point back down to where you want it. if you select the individual pieces, I've already set the pivot points to where they're supposed to be. So if you rotate this fork, the pivot point's where it's supposed to be already. The body already has the pivot point at the bottom. But when we select the entire thing, it goes to a point where it's an average of where all these symbols are, which just happens to be in the middle. So if we're selecting more than one symbol, you always have to move the pivot point to where you want it. Other 2D animation softwares don't do that, where you can link the pieces together, but in Flash, so far you can't do that as far as I know. Okay, so let's set up this launch pose. Bring the pivot point back down and turn them a little bit. Now we have to stretch them. It's very similar to our ball bounce. We're going to have them launch off the ground. Let's bring them to about here. Feel free to skew the character a little bit too. If you place your cursor between the two manipulation points, you'll get this double arrow looking icon. You can skew. So now we have pose 1, pose 2, which is our anticipation pose, and pose 3, where he's launching. So he squashes in the anticipation pose, and he's going to stretch out in the launch pose. Now I'm going to go 3 more frames down the timeline. Select every from top to bottom on our layers. Press F6. Now I want him to go back to his original volume, so he's not stretched or squashed. So I'm really just going to copy all the keys on frame 1. Right click and go copy frames, and paste it onto this new key pose that we're setting. Paste frames. Now for some reason in Flash, whenever you copy and paste frames, it made this new row of keys. I usually just delete them. Clear keyframe. I don't know why it does that. It's always done that for me, and I don't like it. Another little trick here in Flash, instead of dragging to select this whole row, you can click the top one, hold shift down, and click the bottom key on the bottom layer, and it'll select the entire row. Okay, so after our launch pose, we're going to go into this is the top of the bounce where he's going to hang a little bit. So we're going to do 2 key poses up here. So I'm going to give it 3 more frames. So we want that to last a little longer and be a little bit more slower, so we're going to space them apart. Because we're giving it 3 more frames down the timeline, we're adding more in-betweens. It's going to create more in-betweens for us. So again, with the timing, where we want things to move slowly, and I'll just rotate them a little bit on this one. Go back to the other one, select all of it, rotate them back the other way a little bit. It's going to be angled towards screen left here, and then angled back a little bit towards screen right. So this is going to give him a bit of a swing at the top of his bounce. I'm going to go 2 more frames down the timeline, select the top layer, hold shift and select the bottom layer, it gets the whole row, F6 that, and then move our character. And again, we're going to move the pivot point down, select everything, move the pivot point down, and let's give him a bit of a stretch as he comes to his landing, as he moves into his impact pose. And then let's go back to the timeline and go 1 frame down. Select the top, shift select the bottom, F6. Let's move the pivot, and let's put him back. So deselect, reselect the whole thing so that our manipulator is square. Put our pivot point back to the bottom, and let's squash him down. So let's turn off our onion skinning and see what we have so far. Go back to frame 1 and press enter. So this last pose, I'm going to actually bring him down a little bit further. You can select the entire character and use your arrow keys as we did in the previous sessions. You can hold shift down and he'll move quicker. Just want to keep him on the same plane here. Okay, so go down the timeline 1 frame, and let's hold him here for 1 frame. So F6, we're going to hold him at his impact pose. Okay, before we go any further, let's tween all this and see how it looks. So press V on your keyboard for the selection key, for the selection tool. Go anywhere in between pose 1 and pose 2 on the first layer, and shift select the bottom layer, right click and select create classic tween. And we're going to do that for all of these. Okay, so go back to frame 1 and press enter. Yeah, that's actually a little bit slow. I would like to see him launch and land a little faster. We're going to have to drag some of these keys around. So we have, this is frame 1. Frame 2, his anticipation's okay, but the speed in which he launches into the air, I have it 2 frames apart. Let's bring them close. Let's bring these poses closer together so that he launches much quicker. Go to your 3rd key pose and select the top one on the top layer, and the last one on the bottom layer by holding shift down and selecting. It'll select the entire block. Then you can click anywhere in the yellow highlighted area and move it one frame to the left. There, so that brought our anticipation pose and our launch pose closer together. So let's play that and see how that looks. It seems to pop a little bit. Let's put our onion skinning back on for a moment. Let's bring our launch pose down a little bit, closer to the anticipation pose. And just bring the pivot down to the bottom and rotate it a little bit back. Alright, onion skinning off, and let's check it again. That looks better. Sometimes it's just a matter of moving a pose a little bit closer to one or the other. We can leave these tweens in for now. Okay, so let's go back to our impact pose where he's squashed down. So I'm going to tap or step one frame to the right. We already put in a hold there. So now we want him to launch into the air again. What we really can do, because both of these hops are exactly the same height, we can just copy and paste the keys that we've already set. So select the top pose in the top layer, hold shift down, and select the bottom pose in the bottom layer. Whoop, do that again. And we're going to right click and select copy frames. And we're going to go to the next frame and just select a big block, bigger than you think it is, right click and paste frames. It goes back to the original positions of our first jump. So if you play it, it just pops right back. So we're going to have to move those over. Make sure you have 2 frames of your squash pose or your impact pose. We seem to have copied one more over, so let's just delete that. Go clear frames, clear keyframe, and we have our launch pose here. I'm just going to select all of those and move it over 1 frame. So we have our 2 frames of a squash pose, and then he's going to launch. So we're going to have to select this entire row and bring it way over here to where it's supposed to be. And if we drag back and forth, we can see it's in the right spot. Now go to your next pose. You can drag select the entire character here on the stage, or you can select the whole row of keys. Either way works. And bring that over to where that's supposed to be, just somewhere near the top of the hop, somewhere around there. And this is the pose for when he's on his way down. And back to our impact pose. I'm going to hold shift down and just arrow key that over so it's on the same plane. And we want 2 of those. So tap over to the right. Move that one over. Or what might be a better idea is actually just copy, just to make sure that we're in the exact same spot. Copy frames. Select this entire row next to it. Paste frames. And then we have this useless set of keys on the end that always appears when we copy and paste, and just say clear keyframe. Now if we scrub our animation, we should see 2 hops. And if we play it, let's play it. That actually looks pretty good for blocks. Okay, so we're going to do one final small hop here, and we're going to have him flip around, overshoot, and settle. So we can actually reuse some of these poses that we've already done. So now he's squashed for 2 frames, like we've done in the last hop, but we're going to have him still launch up into the air, and then he's going to flip and settle down. We want to copy this pose. Let's go back a little bit. Let's grab this pose, select the whole thing, and let's select right click and select copy frames. Go back to the last pose that we set, and let's tap and let's step 2 frames down the timeline and select the whole row and set a key, or actually select the whole row and right click and say paste frames. Get rid of that last row of frames. Clear keyframe. We can remove this tween as well, and now we'll have to move this entire pose. We'll just select it down here. I'll have to move the entire pose over to here, and since he's not jumping with as much velocity, let's tone down that stretch a little bit and just move the pivot point down. We won't have him stretch quite as much. So our last pose here is just he's at the top of this 3rd bounce. So what we're going to do is we're going to have him come down. We're going to go 1 frame down the timeline. Set a key. We'll bring that pivot point down. And we're going to have him just stretch and squash just a little bit. Okay, so he's starting to land. Let's go 2 more frames down the timeline for our next pose. Bring that pivot point down. And we'll bring him down to the ground plane here. Sometimes that pivot point likes to pop back up to the top. We'll just move it back down if we need to. Okay, so let's straighten him out. Now this is the point where he's going to flip. I'm just going to deselect and reselect so that our free transform tool straightens out. Bring that pivot point back down again. So to flip him, we're going to give him a little bit of an anticipation. So I'm going to squash him down and stretch him out and just give him a bit of a skewing. And then we're going to go back to our timeline and give it one frame down the timeline. Set another key, and we're just going to, in one frame, we're going to pop him from facing left to facing right. So we're just going to grab the edge here and just flip him right around. And let's skew him back so that it sort of matches the last pose. So if we turn on our onion skinning, reduce the range that we can see our frames. We squash them down and then we flip them in one frame. Now I'm just stepping with our greater than less than keys. I'm going to go back and forth, just check those two frames. What I want to do is just try and match it a little bit better. So make sure your pivot point is at the bottom here. Just do your best to match it. It's going to be quick. It's going to happen in one frame. You want to flip the character at the fastest point of movement, or just before and after the fastest point of movement. So right now he's landing. He goes into the squash pose, which is rather quick because the drawings you can see are placed farther apart, and it only happens in one frame. So we're going to flip him really quick in one frame, and then give it maybe 2 or 3 more frames, and bring him up. So we'll set a new key here, 3 frames down the timeline, and we'll bring him back to his original state. Which, you know what? At this point, I don't want to start guessing. But I could eyeball it, or I could go back to frame 1, copy it into this row, and then just move it over and flip them. But I'll just eyeball it for now. So now if we scrub that, turn onion skinning off, let's give it a scrub. Yeah, he looks like he's shrinking and growing here. So we can see that we've lost volume over here. So let's go to this pose. He's simply just gotten smaller, so we need to stretch him out a little bit. Same with this one. And this is something you would have to pay attention to if you were drawing traditional animation. You have to make sure your volumes don't shrink or increase in size. Okay, so we have him squashing, and then he comes up and settles. So at least he's not flipping. So it's a quick turnaround in Flash. Unless you have, the only way to make this a little bit smoother would be to actually create a front view for this avocado character, and then in one of these frames here you would separate these two, this drawing and this drawing, and you'd slip in a front view in between those, and then you'd get a smoother turnaround that way. So Flash sort of lends itself to a quick and snappy style of animation. Okay, so this settle can be probably moved down a little bit, and let's just tween everything now. And let's see how that last part looks. That's not too bad. Okay, so let's select this whole row of tweens, and let's ease it into the last pose. So just select the whole row of tweens and go to the properties area, and under ease just set that to 100, and we'll play that. It comes up nice and soft. We can probably bring this out a little further, maybe 2 or 3 more frames, and try that. There, he eases up nice. Okay, so we have him hopping along, and then on his last little bounce he spins around on his squash and settles. Alright, so now let's set some secondary action on this fork. So go back to frame 1, make sure we're on our fork layer. Frame 1, let's tap down the timeline 1, 2, and set a key in between pose 1 and 2 for the fork. So we'll press F6. This is pose 2. So we set a key in between pose 1 and 2, and what we're going to do is rotate it to overlap the previous drawing. And when we shut onion skinning off, and we'll scrub through, as we get this kind of action. Where as he's on his way down, the fork sort of lags behind and then catches up with the rest of the character. Okay, we're going to finesse this further, but we're just going to sort of rough in our secondary action right now. And our secondary action is going to include some overlap. So as he launches, like that's okay. Go to this next pose. I think we should bring it back on this key pose. Just the momentum of him moving forward. The forks, you have to think the fork is kind of heavy. Actually, on this anticipation pose, we can bring it down a little bit. On the next key pose, now remember we have two key poses for the top of the bounce. So I'm going to bring the fork back a little bit on the first one, and I brought it back a little bit on the second one as well. And this is the pose where he's starting to drop. We can really exaggerate it here and bring it way back. Let's push that as far as we can. Now we have this kind of action. So he's dropping, so the fork's it's a delayed reaction, right? Okay, so now we go into our impact pose. Now remember we have two of these. So on the first one, let's actually bring the fork back a little bit. Again, it's a delayed reaction. And then on the second impact pose, it catches up. So again, he's going to launch. Let's bring it down a bit. At the top of this hop, we'll bring the fork back. If we go into our onion skinning, we can see we've kind of overlapped the poses a little bit. Go to our next key pose where he's dropping, and we can overlap. Again, we can overlap those drawings, the previous drawings. I think I might have brought this one back a little too much. And then a squash pose, we'll bring it down. He's on his way up again, so we'll bring the fork back up a little bit. So at the top of his hop, I'm just going to keep swinging it back. Going to each key pose and just sort of putting the fork where it should be. Okay, so this is the impact where he spins. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit different. What we should do here is add an extra key. So he's coming down, the fork is sort of pointing straight up almost. We should bring this fork back a little bit so it's closer to the last pose. On the next one, we should bring it back as well, matching the last pose a little bit better. Could even overlap it, and we're going to set a new key here. Let's F6 that, and that way we can start to bring it back down to its next, or its resting pose. So let's shut onion skinning off and see how that looks. Something weird is happening on the last hop. Let's check it out. Aha. Let's see. The fork's poking through we have a piece of artwork here for this slit, so we're just going to move this up so it doesn't poke through. Okay, it also doesn't look quite right either when it's animating, so let's just take a look at it. Fix this up. So let's see what's happening here. Okay, as he comes down, maybe that fork should lag behind. So we'll set another key here. Sometimes you do have to put a keyframe on every frame to get it to look right. So I'm just going to scrub with my time marker here, one frame at a time. As it's coming down, it's dragging behind. I can drag behind a little more. And we'll bring this back to match the previous one. See, from between here and here, it's too big of a difference. So on this one, we'll bring it back. All right, so let's take a look at how that looks. You can see the forks, our forks poking out a little bit. All right, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so I can see that better. Let's just play it. That pops a little bit too far, so we're going to move that a little bit back. Okay, and let's put some ease on this. So select anywhere between these. So select anywhere in between these two poses here in the fork layer. And let's just put the ease up to 100. Let's crank it right up. And let's just play that last part. It can be refined further, but let's just check out our entire animation here. Yeah, I really don't like how the fork's snapping so hard forward. So what I'm going to do is just go through and give it one more refining pass and just prevent it from moving so far forward. Let's press Q on my keyboard. Bring that up a little bit. Scrub through and see how that looks. I think on this launch pose it can actually come down a little. Yeah, so this is the biggest problem here. I'm just going to lessen how much that comes down. Maybe even on this pose, bring it down a bit too. Bring it up a bit on the launch pose, just so it doesn't kick forward as hard. We can bring that fork back for sure. Okay, let's play that again. Now for the leaf. So let's go to our leaf layer. Now there's a couple different ways we can handle this. We can just animate it as it is, just flipping it around. Or we can create new drawings for this leaf to make it bend and flap. But let's just animate it as it is and we'll see how that works out. Okay, so as he squashes down, I think that's fine the way it is. As he rushes out of his anticipation pose, we'll bring the leaf down and give it a bit of drag. Let's go to our next key pose. I think that's fine. Next key pose. Let's start to have it lift a little bit. Okay, now he's starting to drop. Actually what I'm gonna do is flip this drawing around. I could create a new drawing to have it flap up, but I can also just flip it around. Okay, and you can see the drawing on the in-between. It's flipping, so it's a really undesirable result. The entire piece of artwork is actually rotating around. So what we can do is just set a key there. And we can copy one over to the other. Copy frames. Paste frames. And what we'll do is we'll just sort of in between that ourselves. If the snap to objects is on and it's bothering you, you can always just shut it off. So I'm going to skew this a little bit. We have to get from here. This is the new one we copied, and then it goes to this. So we have to in between this and that one. The leaf is attached a little bit halfway below the middle of the stem. So let's make sure it's down there. And if we turn on our onion skinning, we can see what we have to in between. And just sort of skew it, rotate it, scale it. Just do what you have to do to sort of make it look like it's somewhere in between those two drawings. I think that should work out pretty well. And take the onion skinning off. Yeah, I think that's going to be okay. And our next pose, this is the last one we did. This is the next pose. Let's bring it up. And let's put it back into its flip. Flip it again. If we check our onion skinning again, I'm always flipping onion skinning on and off as I animate. So he's landed here, so it should probably start to come down, but we kept it flipped over. So let's go to the next pose, and I think this is okay. You can probably just bring it back up here a little bit. Let's check it. Scrub over it a little bit. So that's okay. It looks like the leaf actually bent and it's coming back and it's going to recoil there. Now it's taking off, so we're going to give it some more drag again. Just scrubbing over the animation and checking it. So we're going to give it some drag on this next pose. Start to have it lift a little. It should be lifting here as well. So just dragging over and checking it gives it a nice lift. And then on the way down, should be dragging quite a bit. I'm considering flipping that again. Yeah, I'm going to flip that again. And again, I have to fix that in between. So just go in between those two drawings, set a key, F6, and see if we can grab that. Nope. No, it's too crazy. Okay, so we'll just copy the key before it. Copy frames, paste frames. So that fixes it. But we have to bring it back down to where it's supposed to be attached. Let's turn on our onion skinning so we can in between those. If there's too many drawings to look at, you can adjust the range slider at the top so you can see less drawings. Of course, the darkest one is the one you're adjusting. So I think that should be okay. Okay, so let's overlap this drawing. We can actually overlap these as well. I think that's going to work out nice, just like we did on the last one. This drawing should definitely still be lagging behind a little. You can definitely keep that flipped. And then in the next pose we'll just go back to its original state. So you can see that it flips, the leaf will flip back to its original state at the fastest movement. So you can see these drawings are very far apart. So that means the motion is going to be quick, and that's where you put the flip. And then we're launching back up. That actually looks okay. Note that this pose looks okay. This should start to hang a little bit. Hang and lift. This one should be lifting. Maybe a little more. As he starts to drop, the leaf can lift up a little bit. We're going to set a new key for this leaf. What I'd like to do here, I'm just looking at how he spins around. Turn off onion skinning for a sec. Okay, so this is all fine. This is where he turns. So what we should do is bring this leaf in a little bit. So we want to just squash it a little bit. And just kind of give it the impression that it's starting to turn. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to just give it a squashed shape. Before I do that, I should set a key beside it so that I know it'll return to its original state. So I'm going to scale it, skew it, and do what I need to do. So I can get it into a little bit of a squash state for the turn. And that just sort of gives us the impression that the leaf's at a 3/4 view, 3/4 one side and then the other side. And we can even grab that last key and just drag it out a little bit. Yeah, so it really is in Flash. I mean, when we first start, everything lines up in a row, nice, neat, clean rows. But when we go to do things like overlapping action, where the animation has to offset a little bit, we end up putting keys in between our key poses just to sort of get what we need, and then we can have the leaf settle up a little bit on the very last pose. And let's set the ease up to 100, and let's check that animation. One thing I'm noticing at the end here is that it could be better by having that leaf down a little bit further before it comes up to settle. Just a little bit of overlap on the leaf. So let's just bring it down. Whoops. Just rotate it really. Give it a bit of a skew. Let's just bring the leaf down on both sides. That'll help. Now I'm just going to step through. I think on this pose it should start to come up a little bit more. This one can go down a little bit more. We can bring that, let's just bring that right up. When it flips around, we just brought the leaf right down closer to his body, and then as he settles, it'll rise up, and it gives does help with give the impression that he's finishing a turn. So if we play this now. Alright, so we're going to put some finishing touches on this. We're almost done. What I want to do is just get rid of some of these extra frames we don't need. So let's go to frame, let's say 50, and just cut these out. Remove frames. Let's go to our shot comp here. On frame 50, you can drag to select, or you can just shift select. Remove frames. And go to our scene 1 on frame 50. Remove frames, and actually we'll go back into our shot comp. Let's hide the path of action. Hiding the path of action doesn't hide it from the render. If you don't want the path of action to render, which we don't, it's just a guide for us, you have to right click on that layer and select guide, and that means that it won't render in our movie. One last thing we need to do is we need to animate this shadow. If we scrub through, we can see the shadow just does not go with him. So let's go back into our shot comp. We have the shadow layer. This will be quite simple. All we have to do, because he's moving at pretty constant speed, actually he does hold on the he does hold at his squash pose. So we'll set a key there, F6, and I'm just going to hold shift down and left arrow key to get it over to him. Okay, so drag over till the hold is finished. F6 again, just one frame apart really. And then we're going to go to the point where he stops again, and we'll key it there. Yep, he stops for 2 frames. So we'll key it again on the frame next to that. And then he starts to move again. So go to the part where he stops moving again, which is right here. And I think that's where it'll stay for the rest of it. There we go. Now you can see it just pops from one pose to the next. So we will have to tween those. Classic tween, classic tween, classic tween. And if we play it now, it's all great. Oh, I forgot to set a key before he takes off. So let's just untween that for a moment. Drag over to the part before right when he's coming out of his anticipation pose and going into his launch pose. Probably key it about there, F6. So it's going to hold for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames or so, and then it starts to move. So let's retween that, and we're all set. So that's pretty good. Of course, I would go back and do some refining, like we did in our ball bounce. What we could do is just give the squash a moving hold. We held our squash for 1 frame, so what we could do is just select everything, free transform tool, and just give it a bit of a very slight amount of extra squash, and that'll just give us an extra impression of impact. So it just gives us a tiny bit here, and we'll do it on the next impact. Let's just click scene 1 to go back to our outer layer, and we can watch this. I think that's fine. Any animation can always be improved upon. Helps to be a perfectionist if you're working as an animator. Alright, so now you can save this file, give it a name that you'll remember, but animate it at the end. And you can just send us the Flash file. That's it for Flash Basics 5 Secondary Action. We'll see you in the next class.